The war of words between the United States and Iran continues as the leaders of both countries are among those gathering at the United Nations this week. President Trump is expected to talk about Iran when he speaks to the UN General Assembly tomorrow. This comes days after he approved the deployment of U.S. troops to Saudi Arabia following the attacks on oil facilities earlier this month. During a meeting with Pakistan's prime minister, the president said that American sanctions had taken a toll on Iran.
Iran, if you look at that's been really the state of terror, and I've been saying it's the #1 state of terror in the world. And the agreement we had does not cover that. It was not doing well. It was doing very poorly. And now Iran is doing very poorly. Iran is a different place than when I took over. When I took over the United States, when I became president, Iran was a real threat to the entire Middle East and maybe beyond. And now they're having very, very big difficulties, to put it mildly.
Before he left for New York, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said the U.S. sanctions had failed and that Iran had successfully resisted the pressure. Despite the events in Saudi Arabia and the accusations from both sides, President Trump has not ruled out a meeting with Rouhani while he's in New York. Joining us now to take a closer look at this, former California Congresswoman Jane Harman, who is now president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and Rami Khouri, a senior fellow at the American University of Beirut. He's a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to both of you. Jane, first of all, Donald Trump has sort of exaggerates a bit about Iran, and Iran clearly exaggerates about Iran. They're both a little right? Iran is suffering as a result of these sanctions. But first of all, do you even think these two guys are going to meet? Do you think that's likely, and would that be fruitful?
I think I'm betting Trump would like to meet. I have no insight into this, but I'm betting he would like to meet. What I hope he comes with, though, is a strategy for the meeting. It's not just a photo op. In fact, I think it'd be a disaster if it were a photo op, given Iran's recent attack, or not totally proved, but likely attack on Saudi Arabian oil. So, no, a photo op is a bad idea. A constructive conversation, maybe not over the airwaves, is a good idea. Toward what? What is, frankly, I would say, restoring the terms of the old deal, which he never should have walked away from, but making them stronger. I mean, there is a foreign policy victory here for President Trump if he will focus instead of
strengthening a deal.
On strengthening the deal, instead of just saying it was the worst thing that ever happened in history.
Rami, I remember in detail, I was talking to both of you when the deal happened, the Iran deal happened, and there was nobody in the world who was, dumb enough to think that this was the be-all, end-all, and it was necessarily going to make Iran the best player in the region. But there were hopes and aspirations for it, and there were weaknesses in the deal. But it took the better part of a decade of work to get that deal, and certainly 2 very serious years with U.S. pressure. What does Donald Trump have to do to get this back on the rails? Because, as Jane said, there are a lot of people who thought he pulled the plug on this thing too early.
It's very simple what he has to do, and the Iranians have been very clear about this. The Iranians are always very precise and clear about what they want, and they say what they want, and then they do what they say. They want the unilateral sanctions to be pulled back. It's unlikely that Trump is going to suddenly say, okay, we'll drop all the sanctions, but they want at least substantive movement that is showing the Iranian people and the world that these unilateral sanctions that were put back on after the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of a multinational deal, that these sanctions are going to be slowly withdrawn. That could open the way for the beginning of a dialogue, but there has to be substantive pullback, drawback of sanctions by the U.S. to some extent that will allow this to happen.
Jane, I want to just quickly talk about Israel, and I want to read this because I want to say it properly. It's all very complicated what has happened after this last election. But Israel's president, Reuven Rivlin, has had a second day of talks with both Benjamin Netanyahu and his opponent, Benny Gantz. He has Netanyahu has apparently offered to form a unity government with his rival, Benny Gantz. There seems to be issues in a unity government, they're going to swap. They're going to take turns as who the prime minister is, and everybody wants to be prime minister first. Now, there may be more recent information than even that, but what do you see happening here?
I'm surprised that Rivlin wants them to work it out. I thought he would ask Gantz to try to form a government, which I think would have been the better play. He got a few more seats than Netanyahu did. you know, it's not my country, but I think the future for Israel is a government that is a more unity and pluralistic government. And I think it's good news that the Arab Israelis have endorsed a side in this context.
And they've endorsed his side, Benny Gantz's side.
They've endorsed Gantz's side, and Gantz seems to me to be more interested in the broader coalition, which is, I think, we're in Israel's interest. Last comment on Netanyahu: there are going to be these corruption charges are hanging over his head. Something will happen with that, and I just would hope that Rivlin would act more decisively, and we would move in a more...
That's why Netanyahu wants to stay as president, prime minister, because he's got these charges against him.
Well, I hope he wants to stay as president because he wants to lead the country in a good direction. I'm just saying, I think a pluralist democracy is the best direction for Israel. I think a two-state solution still makes sense, not tomorrow, but over the near period of years. And I think there have been many missed opportunities, and I hope that that will be in Israel's future.
Rami, Benny Gantz is not a dove. This isn't a hawks versus doves thing in Israel. He was the head of the military. He's actually, in some cases, he's been seen to be more hawkish than Benjamin Netanyahu. But he does, to Jane's implication, he seems to have a better sense of engagement with the global community, with the United States, and even in the region. Is that a good read?
That is a good read, but it's really almost irrelevant to the core issue that Israel faces, which is peace with the Palestinians based on equal rights for both people on the basis of UN resolutions and the global consensus that exists. What has happened in Israel is the whole political system has shifted to the right. The same thing has happened in the Arab world as well, Turkey as well, and Iran, all over the region. They've all shifted to the right with a heavy religious dimension to them. And so Gantz and Netanyahu are two parts of the right wing of Israel. Gantz is kind of a little closer to the center, but he's definitely right. Therefore, about 3/4 of the Israeli government essentially don't have a problem with expanding settlements, annexing Arab land, slowly trying to get Palestinians out, and keeping second-class status for the Palestinians, both the ones who are even Israeli citizens who don't have all the same benefits that as Jewish Israelis do, let alone the people who are living under occupation or siege in Gaza. So there isn't much difference between them when it comes to the Palestine-Israel conflict. On other issues, clearly there is a difference.
Well, I would just add to that I think a different coalition would make a big difference in Israel's direction. And I hope, however this ends up, there's a different coalition with the center and a few of the left in there.
Because this one has got us stuck.
Israelis in it, because this one is stuck on the far right. And I hope, however it turns out, that you're wrong, and that there is a future for Israel living side by side with a state of Palestine with secure borders.
Jane, good to see you. Thank you for being here. Jane Harman and Rami Khouri. Jane is the president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Rami is a senior fellow at the American University of Beirut. U.S. Prime Minister Boris Johnson in town for this week's UN General Assembly just sat down with NBC Nightly News anchor Lester Holt.